It was a warm, breezy afternoon in Charleston, South Carolina. The sun hung lazily in the sky, casting a golden hue over Riverside Park. Families strolled leisurely along the pathways, some with strollers, others with leashed dogs. Children ran through the grass, their laughter echoing off the nearby fountains. The smell of barbecue drifted through the air, adding to the easygoing atmosphere that defined the early afternoon. For once, the world seemed calm, almost perfect. Amidst the chatter and movement of the park, Danielle Carter, a 42-year-old law professor at the University of Charleston, sat alone on a worn wooden bench. The book in her hands was thick, one of those classic law texts she often used in her teaching, but today, she was reading it for herself. It was a rare moment of peace for Danielle, an afternoon where she could be just a woman enjoying her solitude, with no classes to teach, no students to guide, and no meetings to attend. Her heels were kicked off, her legs crossed at the ankle, and her mind was completely absorbed in the words on the page. As the pages turned, the soft murmur of the park and the gentle breeze against her skin served as a gentle backdrop, helping her to temporarily escape the pressures of her career. For Danielle, these stolen moments of quiet were precious, like water in a desert. The world outside, with all its complexities and injustices, could wait just a little longer. Then, the moment shattered. The sharp screech of tires sliced through the air, followed by the unmistakable sound of a heavy vehicle pulling into the parking lot. The engine of a police SUV revved loudly as it came to a halt, just a few feet away from the walking path. The sudden noise was jarring. Everything around her seemed to freeze for a moment. Danielle's body tensed as she instinctively looked up from her book. Two uniformed officers stepped out of the vehicle, their eyes scanning the park as they made their way toward her. Their gazes landed on her almost immediately, and there it was, the unmistakable look of suspicion, one she had seen countless times in her line of work, but never directed at her so suddenly. Danielle was the only black woman sitting alone in the area. She felt the weight of their stares as they closed the distance between them. "Ma'am, may we speak with you?" one of the officers called out, his voice dripping with suspicion. Danielle took a steady breath, her pulse quickening ever so slightly. She closed the book in her hands and placed it on the bench beside her. She met the officer's eyes with calm composure. "Sure," she said, her voice steady but cautious. The second officer, Officer Ryan Brooks, stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "We got a report of suspicious activity in the area. What are you doing here?" Suspicious activity? The word struck her immediately. She didn't know whether to laugh or be offended. Suspicious activity? "I'm just reading," Danielle replied, holding up her book as if to prove her innocence. Brooks didn't seem convinced. "Can we see some ID?" he demanded, his tone already taking on an authoritative edge. Danielle's mind raced. She had never experienced anything like this before. She hesitated for a moment, then reached into her purse, her hands moving steadily as she pulled out her South Carolina driver's license. She handed it over to Officer Brooks, who examined it unnecessarily long, his gaze never leaving her. "Danielle Carter. What's your business here, Miss Carter?" he read aloud, as if confirming her identity was the only thing he cared about. "I live in this city. I came here to relax." "Is that a problem?" Danielle replied, her voice tinged with frustration but still composed. Officer Jake Turner, who had been standing by silently, now stepped in. "Are you here alone?" he asked, his hand hovering just near his holstered gun. It was a subtle but chilling move. Danielle felt a flicker of unease. "Yes," she replied, her voice steady, but her eyes never leaving theirs. She could sense where this was going. The questions felt less like a simple check and more like an interrogation. They were not trying to understand what was happening. They were trying to provoke her. She knew this tactic all too well. She remained calm, but her patience was beginning to wear thin. "What am I being accused of?" she asked firmly, her voice now taking on a more commanding tone. "I'm not answering any more questions until you tell me what I'm being accused of." That was when it all spiraled. Without any further warning, Turner suddenly grabbed her arm with a grip that felt like steel. "Don't get smart with us," he snapped, the words coming out like a threat. His fingers dug into her skin, and before Danielle could react, the cold, hard metal of handcuffs clicked into place around her wrists. "You're resisting," Officer Brooks shouted, his voice rising. Danielle's heart slammed against her chest. "What? "I haven't done anything wrong," she exclaimed, her voice rising in shock and confusion. Around them, the crowd that had gathered to watch began murmuring, some pulling out their phones to record what was happening. This wasn't just a random incident. It was becoming a spectacle. "Stop resisting," Officer Brooks shouted again, his tone now almost theatrical, as though he were performing for the crowd rather than responding to reality. He seemed to be relishing the drama of the moment. Danielle stood still, not out of fear, but because she knew there was nothing more she could do. Her mind raced, but her body remained calm. She wasn't going to give them any excuse to escalate the situation further. But it didn't matter. The damage had been done. The officers shoved her into the back of the police SUV, slamming the door shut with an echo that reverberated in her chest. It was the final, brutal confirmation that everything she had worked for, everything she had studied, everything she had fought for, had come to this. She wasn't just a law professor anymore. She was a defendant, an object of suspicion, someone to be discarded and overlooked. As the car pulled away, the weight of it all settled over her. This wasn't the end. It wasn't even close. But one thing was certain. This wasn't just an isolated incident. This was bigger than her. And she wasn't going to let it go. The ride to the police station was suffocatingly silent. The only sound was the faint crackling of the radio as it broadcasted dispatch calls in the background. The occasional static-filled voice of an officer or a faraway, unintelligible chatter from the control room was the only distraction from the chaos swirling inside her mind. Danielle sat in the back of the police SUV, her wrists throbbing from the too tight handcuffs, her body stiff from the uncomfortable position. She had always known that the justice system had its flaws, but she had never felt the sting of it quite like this. Each bump in the road seemed to jolt her back to reality, reminding her of the absurdity of her situation. A law professor, someone who had spent years teaching her students about the rights they were supposed to be afforded under the law, was now sitting in the back of a police car, the victim of an unjust arrest. The irony wasn't lost on her, but there was no time to dwell on it. Her focus shifted inward, trying to hold on to her composure. The last thing she wanted was to allow fear or anger to cloud her judgment. At the police station, the humiliation continued unabated. She was ushered into a sterile, fluorescent-lit hallway where the sharp, buzzing lights overhead made her head spin. There was a sense of coldness in the air, a detached, indifferent atmosphere that hung around the whole process. Danielle was marched into an interrogation room where they fingerprinted her like a common criminal, her fingers pressed against the ink pad, the sensation foreign and degrading. Photographs were taken, her mug shot, the cold flashes of the camera making her skin prickle. She could feel the eyes of the officers watching her, the slight sneers on their faces. One of them, Officer Brooks, looked at her with a mixture of amusement and disdain, as though he were proud of what they had done. "Enjoy your stay," he sneered before locking the door behind her, leaving her in the holding cell. The small room was even more suffocating than the ride to the station. It smelled of disinfectant and stale air, and the light overhead flickered intermittently, casting harsh shadows that seemed to grow with each passing second. She sat on the cold metal bench, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. Her mind raced, replaying the events of the afternoon over and over again, trying to make sense of the senselessness. Why had this happened to her? What had she done wrong? Her thoughts felt like they were spiraling out of control. Danielle had always prided herself on being level-headed, being the one who could find a solution in any problem, but this was different. This was personal. This was a violation of everything she stood for. She wasn't just a law professor anymore. She was a black woman, wrongfully arrested, humiliated, and shoved into a cell like an animal. Hours later, she was pulled from her thoughts by the sound of footsteps approaching the cell. The officer who stood at the door looked young, no more than a few years out of the academy. His uniform was crisp, but there was an uncertainty in his eyes that told her he wasn't the one who had made the decision to arrest her. "Miss Carter," he began, his voice almost too tentative. "You're being charged with resisting arrest and obstructing a peace officer." Danielle didn't react right away. She couldn't believe it. The charges were as baseless as they were absurd. She was an educated woman, a professor who had dedicated her life to understanding the law, and yet here she was, the target of an obvious racial profiling incident. On what grounds? She demanded, her voice low but firm. She had no intention of letting them get away with this without a fight. The officer avoided her gaze, looking down at the floor as he shifted uncomfortably from foot to foot. "You can discuss that in court," he muttered, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. Danielle knew exactly what this was, a case of abuse of power. They had targeted her because of her skin color, and they had done everything they could to make her feel small, to make her feel powerless. But she wasn't powerless. She had the law on her side, and that's what they didn't realize. She wasn't going to let them win this. When she was finally released on bail, Danielle stepped out of the holding facility and into the cool evening air. Her best friend, Melanie Green, a fellow lawyer, was waiting outside. Melanie's face was etched with concern, her eyes scanning Danielle for any signs of injury or trauma. "Are you okay?" Melanie asked, her voice gentle, yet filled with worry. Danielle nodded, though the tremble in her hands betrayed her outward calm. She could feel her chest tightening, a mixture of anger, frustration, and helplessness rising up within her. "I'm fine," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. But inside, she made a promise to herself. She wasn't letting this go. She would fight for justice, for accountability, and for every person who had ever been wrongfully treated the way she had been. That night, after a long dinner with Melanie, Danielle returned to her apartment. She didn't go to bed right away. Instead, she sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by legal pads and law books, her mind already working through the logistics of the case. She had the resources, the knowledge, and the expertise to fight back against what had happened to her. "I have the tools, the knowledge, and the resources to fight back," she said aloud, as if speaking the words into existence. She looked at Melanie, who had stayed by her side, offering silent support. "And I will. They won't get away with this." Melanie gave her a knowing look, one of quiet encouragement. "I'm with you every step of the way." Danielle nodded, determination in her eyes. She had always believed in the power of the law, but now she was going to show the world just how much it could be wielded in the fight for justice. Weeks passed, and Danielle worked tirelessly to build her case. She pored over legal documents, made phone calls, and reviewed the footage of her arrest, which had gone viral shortly after the incident. The video, captured by a bystander, showed the officer's unjust treatment of her. It quickly spread across the city, sparking outrage and drawing widespread attention to her situation. The public response was overwhelming. People from all walks of life reached out, offering support and demanding accountability for the officer's actions. The video had ignited a firestorm, but it also gave Danielle something powerful: the momentum to push forward. The online outrage fueled her determination, solidifying her resolve. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for anyone who had ever been wronged by the system, anyone who had suffered from racial profiling, from mistreatment, or from the abuse of power. But as much as she focused on preparing her case, something in the back of her mind nagged at her. The thought of facing those officers in a courtroom sent a chill down her spine. There was an underlying fear, one she tried to ignore, that the power imbalance she had faced that day would somehow repeat itself in a new form. But there was no turning back now. She had come too far, and she couldn't let the fear of facing her oppressors deter her. Then, one day, something unexpected happened. Danielle's phone rang in the late afternoon while she was going over some legal briefs at her kitchen table. It was her attorney, and his tone was far more cautious than usual. "Danielle, you should know something," he said, hesitating as if weighing each word carefully. Danielle sat up straighter, her heart rate increasing as she braced herself. The last thing she needed was more bad news. "What is it?" she asked, trying to keep the tremor out of her voice. Her attorney paused for a moment. "You've been assigned as the judge for one of their cases next month." Danielle froze. The phone felt heavier in her hand, and her stomach dropped. She had to fight to process what he had just said. The words lingered in the air, and for a moment, everything around her felt distant. The same officers who had arrested her, the ones who had humiliated her in front of a crowd, would soon be sitting in her courtroom. She couldn't believe it. The irony of the situation hit her like a ton of bricks. It was poetic justice in its purest form. But could she remain impartial? Danielle's mind raced as she tried to picture the scene. Could she hold her emotions in check when faced with the men who had tried to strip her of her dignity? Could she give them the fair trial they were entitled to, despite the personal pain their actions had caused her? It was the ultimate test of her resolve. She took a deep breath, exhaling slowly, trying to steady herself. She wasn't sure what the answer was yet, but she knew this was far from over. The fight for justice, for herself and for others, had only just begun. The courtroom was packed. The air was thick with anticipation as spectators whispered amongst themselves, their voices hushed by the heavy atmosphere. Cameras flashed from the back of the room, capturing the high-stakes moment as the trial began. Officers Brooks and Turner, who had been so sure of themselves during the arrest, now sat at the defendant's table, their backs straight and faces stoic. But the tension in the room was palpable. They seemed confident, their expressions guarded, as if nothing could faze them. But all that changed the moment the door to the judge's chambers swung open. The silence that followed was immediate and all-encompassing. Every head turned toward the entrance, where the figure of the judge emerged, her presence commanding attention with each step she took. Danielle Carter walked into the courtroom, her black robe flowing behind her like a wave of authority. The heels of her shoes clicked against the polished floor, sharp and deliberate, as she made her way toward the bench. The room seemed to hold its collective breath. Her steps were measured, her gaze unwavering, and her posture was as confident as it had ever been. She was no longer the woman who had been humiliated, arrested, and treated like a criminal. She was now the judge, ready to preside over the very officers who had tried to strip her of her dignity. As she climbed the stairs to the bench, Danielle's eyes briefly flickered to the defendant's table, where the two officers sat. The moment their eyes locked, their expressions froze. Brooks and Turner, who had spent that afternoon dismissing her, questioning her very right to exist in that park, stared at her in shock. Their faces went pale. It was her. The woman they had humiliated was now the one deciding their fate. The sudden shift in their demeanor was evident. Gone was their earlier bravado. Gone was the confidence that had defined their behavior during her arrest. They were no longer in control of the situation. The woman they had looked down upon was now in a position of power, positioned above them in every sense of the word. Danielle took a moment to let the weight of the moment settle. She allowed herself to acknowledge the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just a trial. This was poetic justice in its purest form. It was everything she had fought for, everything she had endured, all coming to fruition in a single, defining moment. With a calmness that belied the storm of emotions surging through her, Danielle looked down at the officers and addressed the room. "This court is now in session," she said, her voice clear and firm. "Please be seated." The officers, unable to mask their discomfort, slowly sat back down, their heads lowered in an involuntary show of submission. It was a quiet but powerful statement. The courtroom remained silent, the weight of Danielle's words echoing in the air. She had the power now, and the fight for justice was hers to win. Throughout the trial, Danielle remained calm, impartial, and professional. She sat at the bench with an air of authority, her face expressionless, though inside, emotion swirled like a storm. Every word spoken, every piece of evidence presented, and every argument made was a reminder of the wrong she had suffered, and yet, she never allowed those feelings to show. The law had to be the guiding force here, not her personal experiences. The principles of justice had to prevail, and Danielle was determined to ensure that they did. But the irony of the situation wasn't lost on anyone. The officers, once so certain of their actions, now found themselves in a courtroom under the scrutiny of the very woman they had tried to silence. The room was filled with a quiet tension as the prosecutors presented damning evidence, each piece pulling the carpet further from beneath the officers' feet. Videos from the day of the arrest, witness testimonies, and photos of Danielle's injuries all painted a picture of unchecked power, misused authority, and a complete disregard for her rights. As the prosecutor laid out the case, the officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Their earlier bravado had completely evaporated, replaced by unease. Confidence drained from their faces, and their postures slouched as the gravity of the situation dawned on them. Officer Turner was the first to look away, unable to meet Danielle's gaze. Officer Brooks, on the other hand, seemed to shrink into his chair, his eyes darting nervously around the room. The power dynamic had flipped in a way they had never expected, and the realization hit them harder than any legal argument ever could. Then, it was time for Officer Brooks to take the stand. He stood slowly, his movements stiff, his face pale. He gave his testimony in a voice that wavered, cracking under the weight of the pressure. "At the time, I thought my actions were justified," Brooks stammered, his words coming out in fits and starts. "But, looking back, I could have handled it differently." The room fell silent, all eyes on him as he struggled to meet anyone's gaze. His voice grew quieter with each passing second. The prosecutor, a seasoned attorney who had carefully built the case, didn't hesitate. By not tackling an unarmed woman in a public park, the prosecutor shot back, his words sharp and precise. Brooks' face flushed with embarrassment, and he looked down at the ground, his voice completely silent. He didn't respond. What could he say? The evidence was clear, and the damage had been done. By the end of the hearing, Danielle knew what was coming. It was a small victory in the fight for justice, but a significant one nonetheless. The officers were suspended without pay and required to undergo extensive retraining on appropriate conduct and respect for citizens' rights. Formal disciplinary records were placed on their files, a permanent mark on their careers. It wasn't the same as erasing the wrong they had done, but it was a step toward accountability. As the courtroom began to clear, Officer Turner hesitated by the door, casting a glance toward Danielle. His body language was slumped, and his earlier arrogance had been replaced by something else, guilt, perhaps, or regret. He took a deep breath before stepping forward. "Your Honor," he mumbled, his voice almost too quiet to hear. "I'm sorry." The words hung in the air, but Danielle didn't react immediately. She sat back in her chair, allowing the moment to linger. It wasn't enough. The harm had already been done, and a simple apology could never undo the humiliation, the fear, or the loss of dignity she had endured. But still, it was a start. The acknowledgement that they had made a mistake, that they had crossed a line, was a small but important beginning. Danielle let the silence stretch before she finally spoke, her voice calm and steady. "It's a start," she said, the words measured. The officers left the courtroom, and Danielle, though far from finished with her fight for justice, sat quietly for a moment, knowing that this small victory had begun to shift the balance of power in her favor. Danielle didn't celebrate when the trial ended. She didn't feel the weight of victory lift from her shoulders, nor did she take a moment to bask in the sense of justice she had so rightfully earned. This wasn't just about her. This was about something far bigger. It was about all the people who had been silenced, humiliated, or dismissed by a system that was supposed to protect them. It was about the countless victims of racial profiling, of police brutality, of unchecked power. For them, her victory meant more than a personal triumph. It was a small, hard-won step toward the justice they so desperately deserved. But the fight was far from over. Danielle knew this. She could feel the fire of that realization burning deep within her, fueling her determination to continue the fight for reform. She didn't stop after the trial. She didn't allow herself to rest on the laurels of that one success. Instead, she poured herself into the movement, attending community meetings, engaging in difficult conversations, and working tirelessly to push for real, systemic change. She advocated for policy changes that would hold police officers accountable for their actions, ensure that citizens were treated with dignity and respect, and fight to end the culture of impunity that allowed abuses of power to persist. Her face became familiar at town hall meetings, her voice unwavering in the fight for equality and justice. She knew that her efforts alone wouldn't be enough to bring about the change she wanted to see. It would take the collective power of many, but she was determined to be a catalyst. She believed in the possibility of a world where law enforcement was truly held accountable, and she wasn't going to stop until she saw it realized. One evening, after a particularly long day of meetings, Danielle was walking back to her car when she was approached by an elderly woman. The woman's hair was gray, her step slow but steady. She had been sitting in the back of the room during one of Danielle's speeches that evening, listening intently to her words. As Danielle passed by, the woman gently reached out and touched her arm, causing her to stop. "Thank you," the woman said, her voice trembling with emotion. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "What you did in that courtroom, it meant the world to us." Danielle's heart softened at the woman's words. She smiled, though it was a quiet, reserved smile, one that carried the weight of everything she had been through and the knowledge that the journey was far from complete. "This is just the beginning," Danielle replied, her voice firm but filled with warmth. She meant it. She knew that the fight would not be easy, and there would be more obstacles ahead. But for the first time, she truly felt the power of her advocacy. The change she was fighting for wasn't just a personal mission anymore. It was a collective effort, one that transcended the courtroom and reached into every corner of the community. And with that thought, Danielle walked away, her resolve stronger than ever.